Always, if you'd like to join the conversation, please text us in the studio on 0493 213 831, and we'd love to hear from you. My conversation partner this evening is Dr. Lee Kofman. She is the author of 6 books, including a book on writing, The Writer Laid Bare, Memoirs Imperfect, which was shortlisted for NIB Literary Award, and The Dangerous Bride. She is the co-editor of Rebellious Daughters and editor of Split, which was listed for the ABIA Awards, anthologies of memoirs by prominent Australian authors. Her short works have been widely published in Australia and overseas, and her blog was finalist for Best Australian Blogs in 2014. Lee also teaches writing and mentors writers. Welcome to the program, Lee.
It's very good to be here, and thank you for having me, Ilana.
So glad to have you. So glad to have you in the studio. My few guests recently have been remote, have been dialing in, so it's really great to have someone here with me again. And hello to those watching on YouTube and live streaming and can see us tonight as well.
Hello.
The question I like to ask all my guests, and it's how I like to open these conversations, is to find out, what's your earliest memory of a building or place?
That's a wonderful question. My earliest memory would be actually not of a building. It will be of it actually will be of building made of snow, because I was born in Siberia. And I just remember walking around with my grandfather, and he would often help me to build. The snow was piled so high in winter; it was like minus 40 there. And my grandfather would help me to build like kind of little houses, little caves inside the snow, and I would sit there. So
little igloos.
Yeah, little igloos. You can tell. Exactly right. Yes.
Did you use a saw? Was it done by hand?
I can't remember that well, but I think probably there was some shovel involved in this. Yes, yeah.
Shout out to my university lecturer who once said to me that igloos are like pancakes. Your first one is not the best.
Yes, and to be honest, it actually was quite warm in those self-made igloos, much warmer than in many other places that I lived as a child, because my parents were students when I was little, and they committed the crime of in the Soviet Union. It was they committed the crime of getting married and breeding while they were still doing their higher degrees. My mother was doing her master's, my father was doing his PhD, and the universities in the Soviet Union did not appreciate this when some of the brilliant students there, sort of, because my parents were, would have also a personal life. They were not supposed to have personal lives, so they were thrown out of the university dormitories when my mother was pregnant. And so I remember, in terms of buildings, throughout my childhood, my early childhood, I'm talking about being 3 and 4 and 5, and moving from one village to another, because my parents were poor students and there was not many sort of places even to rent, and we would usually live in those wooden huts. The toilet would be outside. Often in freezing winter you would go there. There were lots of mice around, so one of my earliest memories, that's to do with play still, is seeing my father in the toilets outside. The toilet is also a part of building, I suppose. Drowning mice. That's sort of So definitely snow-made igloo was a bit of a more, I think, comfortable version of home in some ways.
A joyous memory.
Yeah, a joyous memory, yeah.
Wow. How did writing come for you?
How I started writing. So I started writing at the age of 3. I wrote my first poem then, and it went like this, Ilana. Tell me if you like it. It went, a bluebird flies high, a bluebird flies in the sky. So I recited it to the illiterate village babushkas, and they really loved it. And so that was my kind of moment of fame, and I decided it's actually going to be really fun to be a writer. I must say, in my later poems that I wrote in my adulthood, I don't think I surpassed that first poem, especially in terms of its reception.
And
so I turned to prose.
And the purity of that. So this is still in Siberia.
That was still in Siberia. But then
The babushkas, there's old ladies, illiterate.
illiterate village ladies.
Was
We
there
really loved
electricity?
it. In some places there was not always reliable electricity, and really, I mean, it was so cold often. I mean, even in winter, we would wake up and we would keep, because we had the toilet outside, in the bathroom outside, we would keep some water in a bucket inside the room we would rent. We would all be in one room usually, the three of us, me and my parents, and the water would be completely frozen in a bucket. So actually, Freud said that one of the best things that can happen to a writer is to have a difficult childhood. So I really got lucky, as you can see here. But I really started writing prose properly at the age of 8. I was a very sickly child. I was born with a very faulty heart, didn't work very well. And until I was about 8, my parents actually didn't know, my doctors didn't know if I'll actually live to adulthood or not, because I needed the open heart surgery. But at the time, and it was quite a simple heart defect, but at the time in the Soviet Union, even though I'm talking about now, 70s or early 80s, but at the time the medicine there was like, 1950s in the West. So nobody knew if I'll get through that surgery. And so I was bedridden for most of my years until when I was 8.5. I had finally the doctors thought that I was strong enough to be operated on. So I read a lot. So most of my friends were books. we were we had lots of books at home, as every Soviet family did, because they came really cheaply. It was mass produced by the state, and we didn't have much other entertainment. So in the Soviet Union, even truck drivers, could recite Dostoevsky or Tolstoy. But even by Soviet standards, we had a lot of books in our house. So it was really natural for me to start thinking about life in stories and just sort of weave my own stories.
What were the themes or the topics of those 8-year-old writings?
So mostly fairy tales. I mean, I was a very strange child, Ilana. It may sound now improbable, but I have my parents for proof. I read Tolstoy's War and Peace when I was 8.
All of it? Front to back? You didn't skip the bits?
Well, I did skip all war bits. All war bits. So I really went for the romance.
Straight to the piece?
The peace and the romance, yeah.
I heard people do that. If you skip the war part, you get straight to the soap opera.
Exactly. Although it wasn't that soap opera. It was pretty psychologically good, as I discovered later when I read it as an adult. But also, apart from Tolstoy, apart from being so weird, I also grew up on a really rich diet of fairy tales. So I didn't just and not just fairy tales, but fables and mythology. Like I read everything. I read Indonesian folklore, ancient Egyptian mythology, all that sort of stuff. So when I started Scandinavian mythology, you just name it, anything. So when I started writing at 8, of course I started writing fairy tales. But because in fairy tales that I read, I don't need to tell you about it. You know all about what girls do. They're very passive. They sleep. They wait for the prince to sort of rescue
It's not exactly
them.
a feminist experience for those fairy tales, that's for sure.
No, but they made me feminist because I would read them and I was just sieve and go, well, I want to do things, and I couldn't do much because I was bedridden. So in my fairy tales, there were the princesses who would rescue the princes and slaughter the dragons. So from very early age, I started doing what I still do now that I'm 50. I rewrite the word. I don't rewrite the word in a way that I want it to be. It's more like I rewrite the script for myself, how I want to live. I often do this. I always write about things that bother me, and I try to fix them. And that's why, even though I'm a literary writer, which means I'm a writer who doesn't make much money from her books, but I kind of make money in a way. I save money because instead of going to therapy and paying $200 an hour, I write my problems into the books.
The art is the process,
Yes.
is the catharsis.
Is the well, it's not even catharsis. It's more like I'm trying to understand myself. It's not so much emotional for me as analytical. Actually, I'm trying to understand myself, and once I understand things, how they work, and why did I do what I do, or why things happen the way they happen, or how things affected me, I kind of get it out of my system. So, for example, my first book in English, which was also my first memoir, because my first 3 books were in Hebrew and they were fiction. So my first book in English and my first memoir was about my experiences of non-monogamy, about my brilliant failures in non-monogamy. And it really bugged me for a long time why I, who really wanted to be non-monogamous since I was a teenager, when finally I had twice opportunities with willing partners to do it, why did I fail so bizarrely at both times? And once I wrote the book and worked it out why, I'm no longer interested in the topic. I mean, I'm interested on a personal level maybe, but not to write about it, not to think about it, doesn't bother me. But people still send me to this day. That book came out 10 years ago. People still send me to these days a lot of articles about polyamory, ethical non-monogamy. And I'm like, yes, interesting, but I got it out of my system. Now, next problem. I always have problems, There's no shortage what to write about.
There's always a story. What is the current topic?
Well, the current topic is less funny. The current topic is, with what it's like to be a Jew in the contemporary world post-October 7, but also before October 7. I really want to process my Jewishness.
Thank you for being so open and so true to yourself and sharing so much of yourself with us on this program. There's something I love so much about the conversations I have is how earnest people are and how much they're able to share and let us into their world.
Thank you.
A lot of your writing is about place, though, and you really connect to that theme, and that's something I really want to get into tonight and talk about some of the world building that happens as part of writing. How did the interest in place come for you?
So look, I'll definitely, this is a great question. I would love to answer it. But just before this, I'll say I am absolutely deeply a writer of place. So apropos that book about non-monogamy, The Dangerous Bride, my memoir, even when I wrote about my non-monogamous experiences, all my misadventures in romantic life, the subtitle of that memoir is Memoir of Love, Gods and Geography. Geography just creeps on me. I cannot write. I didn't intend it to be like this. I only put together this subtitle after reading several drafts that I've written and understanding that I can never separate anything I write from a place. And now to go back to your question, why I'm interested in place, I think it's because I'm the stereotype of the wandering Jew. It would be safe for me to say that I'm 50 now, and it would be safe for me to say that I lived in more houses or apartments than my age. So definitely way over 50. I've been constantly on the move all my life. I mean, even, this early story of Siberia that I just told you, my parents and I never, until I was 6 and we moved to Ukraine, because my father's from Ukraine. So we moved to Odessa. Until we moved to Odessa, we just constantly moved from house to house. And then, of course, I started moving countries because from Russia, we moved to Israel. From Israel, I went by myself and came to Australia. Inside every country I've ever lived, I moved cities a lot. And even in Melbourne, I mean, I've been now in Melbourne for close to 25 years. I've moved so many suburbs and houses. So because I've moved so much, I think place becomes. I think maybe I have some kind of comparison. I can see how much places affect us, how much places imprint themselves onto us. And when I say place, I'm not talking just about geography, even though I write a lot about geography. I really strongly believe that any space we inhabit really builds us with different people in different places. So in my 20s, I had my own business in Tel Aviv. I used to run dance parties. And of course, because I ran dance parties, part of my job was to go to other dance parties. So nightclubs were my sort of habitat. I would go out 5 times a night for several years, just because that was my work, and I loved it as well. But you turn to somebody else in a nightclub. It's smoky and dark, and you often don't know people, and you might be disinhibited. You might be deafened a bit by music. It's a place of can be a place of transgression. It can be a place of trying on different identities. When I fly in aeroplanes, I'm somebody else. I'm somebody else as well. Aeroplanes mean a huge deal to me because I'm a person who is constantly overworked, very busy. I mean, a lot of people are very busy, of course, but it's also my nature, you know. I won't downplay it and say just the circumstances. And I've got now 2 small children as well. So for me, being in an aeroplane, it's incredible experience. I always wait for this. I much more enjoy being in an airplane than actually in my destination wherever I go, because it's like I'm in a bubble. I'm
so
suddenly
peaceful.
It's peaceful. I'm free of any responsibility. And my biggest fear in airplanes is that the person next to me will talk to me. And so in airplanes, I become somebody else. I become extremely antisocial. I don't even make eye contact on 24-hour journeys or whatever in flights.
I could really relate to that. I was quite upset when they brought Wi-Fi in on flights, because then you had to fight the urge and turn your phone off fully, and I liked it when there was no hope of being bothered.
Yes. Well, I kind of pretend when there's no Wi-Fi on planes. I never. But that's maybe because I'm older. I'm used to not being around Wi-Fi.
It's interesting, this exploration of essentially third spaces, or a place you can go to be someone else, to find another part of yourself, perhaps.
Absolutely. But also domestic spaces are fine. I mean, I'm a really, actually, even though I've lived quite something that might sound a bit adventurous life, and probably I did, but I'm also a very domestic person. I love homes, I love houses, I love interiors, and I find that places where I stay or where I live and the way they are, they really again affect how I live my life. So my husband and I lived in Bali for 3 months about 10 years ago. And we had a beautiful villa, and, you know, it was fantastic, but our bedroom was not very comfortable for some reason. And it really affected our intimacy. So we actually ended up spending most of our evenings. Usually, I'm a horizontal person. I can spend my whole life in bedrooms, you know, eat there, do everything there. I'm not going to go into any, don't worry, not too much information here. But all I'll say is that the whole family, we spend a lot of time in bed, me and my husband and my kids. We read books there. But because the bedroom in that particular beautiful place didn't work for us, my husband and I spent our nights mostly in like outside in this kind of courtyard, the Balinese style courtyard, and that affected our relationship. It actually was not great in some ways for our intimacy in those 3 months. We still, I mean, were good together, but it kind of, I was very relieved in some ways when we went back to our house. So I really strongly feel that places shape our lives in so many ways. And in my writing, I love exploring it. I feel that it's not even that I love exploring it, but I mean, it's my duty as a writer to explore it, I think, because if I want to engage seriously with human condition, I cannot deny the very strong pull that places have on us.
It's so wonderful to hear someone outside the discipline of architecture and design to say that. And this is one of the great wonders of this conversation that we're having this evening, and the really important moment is how you're able to describe exactly why that place, that home, the design that works, the design that doesn't work, why that's important. Because everything's a design decision. And of course, everything can take funds and can take time, or can take skills if you're going to do it yourself. But there's opportunity and agency to change that home, to change that space, to improve it. So it's really warming and heartening to have this conversation. I think to delve into that, particularly because my profession isn't necessarily always good at that, isn't necessarily very good at advocating why that space and that home is so important. and I love hearing from the public or to speak to the broader public about why we need that. So I wonder also if you can have some advice or some tips or some lessons for us about how do you connect to the place that you're in better. No, I will ask about writing because you run workshops in this topic, but even how do you start noticing things?
Well, actually, if I can share an experience of it, will be more pertinent to the architecture. One of the houses I lived in with my husband, we actually worked together with the architects of that house. We bought this really rundown house and got really wonderful architects to work with us to make it what we wanted it to be. And one of the things and we shopped around a lot in terms of like who is going to design our house, and one of the architectural teams who came to us, I remember that's not the one we went with eventually. I said something that I wanted to do in the house because I'm a bit crazy. I love crazy spaces. I'm not unconventional. Crazy is not the right word. Unconventional spaces. I'm unconventional, so. I said something to this architect what I wanted to do, and they said, "That's just simply stupid."
Oh no, I'm so sorry.
Now that's okay. I mean, I didn't. It's not about my ego. I didn't care what they said. Whether my idea was stupid. What I did care about is that they didn't even consider that could be interesting. It could be, but something which is very unusual can be actually really interesting. And then we found those people who were completely like. Let's just understand what you want, and they designed a really unique house for us. But actually was in some architectural magazines as well, and in the Age. Because I'm a person of color. I love it really drives me nuts. But everything today is beige and all these neutral colors. So we did
millennial grey.
Oh, yeah, exactly. All this, exactly. The gray. It just it just doesn't work for me at all. Not with my personality.
Yeah.
I'm more like, Frida Kahlo, Mexican kind of colors, that sort of stuff. So they did. So I told them what I like, and they just did really insane things in the house. We just worked so well. Like we had this. My favorite color is yellow. We had this bright yellow staircase that descended in. It was 2-story house that descended into the kitchen and became apricot colored kitchen bench. Sound revolting. It was beautiful, at least in my
sounds
view.
So fun. And they listen to you. This is the most important thing, listeners. When you're picking your team, when you're getting to know somebody, you're not actually just buying a house or buying a service. You are buying 2 to 3 to 4 years of an architect's life. You're actually buying a relationship. You are spending time together.
Yes.
You're getting to know each other. You're sharing intimate details of the color that you want your staircase to be and beyond.
Yes. Yeah. And we really want, it was really great to find a team after, we tried quite a few who just wasn't scared of bringing crazy colors into the house and strange things. So to me, I really understand how much the color around me as well impacts me, my moods and if I'm not surrounded by color, I am colorless myself. I write less good as well.
That's really interesting. It's
so
that environmental, environmental psychology. So you're not the kind of person to go off into the forest somewhere, quiet cabin to write?
I could do this as well because I love green. See,
that's true. As well. And that's actually a very astute observation because nature isn't neutral. Nature isn't bland and beige and light brown and boring.
Exactly.
Nature's vibrant and textured.
Exactly. And I wrote a book about writing. That's my latest book, and I have a whole chapter. So the book is about writing life and what writers need and what we do and stuff like that. So I dedicated the whole chapter to writer's space. So because I was really interested in, because my sort of argument is that when we need to, we will write anywhere if we're really dedicated to our art. However, if we not in a emergency situation and there is a choice, it's really important to have a fit between a writer and the environment. And some writers, and every writer needs something else in the environment, which is really interesting because I also strongly believe, based on my experience at least, that how the cliche goes that you can't escape your troubles. Your troubles will follow you everywhere, no matter where you go. See, I don't believe that. I mean, to some extent, it might be true, yes. But I also think, I really believe there is a fit between a place and a person. At least that's how it worked out in my life. But anyway, but back to this idea of the writer space. So, for example, for me, when I have to, I write in any way. I mean, look, when I had a deadline for my memoir, Imperfect, for example, I had a baby and I had a toddler at home, and I had a deadline for the book, so I would just write in a playroom on a floor. With one of my children screaming next to me and the other banging his trucks and trains. So, like, if I need, I'll do it. But now that they're a little bit older and I don't have to do this and they go to school, my preference, for example, is always to write on the couch in my living room, even though I have a really nice study, because when I say nice study, I mean study full of books. That's what nice study for me is.
Yeah.
But I would prefer to write on the couch, because the way I even sit, the way my body is positioned there, it's more comfortable. And also there's a lot of artwork around me which I gaze at and inspires me.
Wonderful. Is that your favorite place you've ever written in?
No. So it's kind of sorry. It's kind of fluctuates a bit for me, and that's another thing that I kind of argue in that book that I wrote on writing. That's why I'll just get some water.
No worries at all. Take your time.
But one of the things I argue is that there's no such thing as a writing process. There are writing processes for different writers, but also for us, as for each individual writer, our needs can shift. So there was a time in my life that I wrote the best in cafes. And again, I had to find very specific cafes with very specific interior design that will work for me.
Oh, tell me more.
So they had to have couches.
Oh,
once again, then I will last. I last on couches for many more hours physically than I am at the desk. I'm not good at writing at the desk at all. I'm not like Truman Capote, who had to write horizontal in his bed. A lot of writers do that. Nabokov used to do it before he became vertical writer and only wrote standing. But I'm very happy with couches. and the cafe had to be not too bright in terms of like lights. And my very preference was for cafes that had corners, so I would always find a corner to write, because again, all these things, they shape your working output, and it took me years to realize this.
It sounds like it's incredibly individual. It's even very, very individual to what stage in your life you're at.
Exactly.
But when your mentees come to you and say, where should I write? What do I do? What advice do you give them?
To experiment. In fact, I design one of the things I do in my teaching. I design quite a few courses on demand for different organizations, and there's a course that I designed for Kill Your Darlings, which is a magazine and also a place that have writing courses. And the course is about sustainable writing practices. And what I do there is I give one of the exercises that I offer in this course is for writers to experiment. So they have to, like, every week do writing in a different place. It can be a public library, can be a particular room in the house, can be a cafe, can be by the beach, or forest, as you said, and just to see where they write the best. I used to have a student who used to take long train journeys both ways just to write on a train because it worked for him.
Wow.
So really spaces, it really spaces seep into us. And I'm just thinking here about, this is beyond writing now, but on a deeper level as well, I'm thinking about Joan Didion, for example. Have you read her, Ilana?
No, I haven't.
Joan Didion, I used to say she's one of my favorite living writers, but she died a couple of years ago, sadly. Well, she was in her 90s. She's one of the most fabulous writers of plays. And when she moved from New York she's an American writer, so when she moved from New York to Los Angeles, she wrote an amazing essay called Los Angeles Notebook, and she really makes such great observations about how Los Angeles weather, for example, affects you. She writes something like, I'm paraphrasing her amazing, writing. I can't say it like this, but she said something like, because of all the earthquakes and in Los Angeles, people always live on a, I don't know how to pronounce the word, the precipice.
Yeah.
Precipice.
Yeah, precipice.
Precipice. Thank you. They always live on the edge. They're much more aware of the fragility of the of life. They're more nervous as well. They're more anxious in some ways. And of course, there's other factors as well in Los Angeles make you anxious. But it's just very beautiful how she really draws explicit those connections. Of course, we all speculate. We always speculate. But, when I say, and I often say that the fact that toilets shaped my childhood a lot. I mean, the fact that we had those external toilets in Siberia. And then when we moved to Odessa finally and had the luxury of having an apartment that we shared with my father's mother, so my grandmother. It was a very strange apartment, small apartment with interconnected rooms. My grandmother never knocked on doors. So she always went through our rooms. The room was in the middle. But we actually had a kitchen, a proper kitchen. We actually had a proper indoor toilet. My uncle built this toilet, and the only place he could build it in, technically in that little apartment, was next to the dining table in the kitchen.
Oh no.
So exactly. Oh no. So that shaped my life too. My disgust level threshold is very low. I think I'm traumatized from the toilet.
You're a very tough woman, Lee.
The opposite these days. I'm disgusted so easily.
It's not an uncommon place in the home to shape experiences and even to shape thoughts. So that spatial importance, the spatial importance of living and dwelling and considering how it impacts you is very, very profound. You often teach your students about writing for place, and you specifically do workshops in this topic. What do you think it is that draws people in? Why is this something that's so interesting for students to come to?
I think it's because the most sort of fundamental fact of human existence, human condition is, first of all, we all have bodies. But the second thing is that these bodies are always in some kind of space. And I think writers know this, even if it's subconsciously. So really, as I was saying before, we cannot write authentically about what it's like to be a human being without without describing the places. But a lot of writers also come to this workshop because they think, I'm now being a bit like, talking like dinosaur, like this older woman, but a lot of the younger writers, they don't read much, and they sort of, it's sadly, that's what sort of happens, that's what I see around, and they artistic intake, they take a lot from television series, which can be amazing, of course, and from movies, which are always set in places. So they understand what so they also get it from there, what settings are important. But a lot of people who come to my classes, they come because they want to make the writing more vivid, more descriptive. They want to make it more cinematic, of course, having watched all those Netflix series. And I always say that I will teach them, I will help them to how to make choices about how you describe a place. But that's the very, very, very starting point only of what we can do with place in writing. We can do so much more. And really, I have a whole, again, in the Writing Led Bear, in my book on writing, I have a whole chapter on writing place. And for me, the most interesting thing about writing place is to understand, first of all, as we discussed already in detail, how places shape us, but also the opposite side of it, how we shape places to express ourselves. And this is where, again, architecture is so essential. I mean, we talked about beige, how it's in vogue now, and it makes me think, well, what does it say about our society? It's a risk-averse society, because nobody can say, apart from me, maybe that grey is revolting. It's supposed to be a neutral color, whereas people can be really put off by yellow. Some
sort of also impermanence or insecurity. A lot of people make that decision because they think, I won't be here forever, I'll sell it.
That's such a great point. I haven't considered. So true. So true.
Instead of feeling like they're a custodian of the building and saying,
So
I will
true.
make something beautiful so that even if I sell it, it will still be beautiful.
So true.
Or while I live here, let it be beautiful for me. Let it be beautiful for my family.
Yes, but it's also kind of, to me, I absolutely agree. But it's also like some kind of conformity to me as well. We see what everywhere's grey, so okay, I'll have my house too, just like my neighbors. So I think there's quite a lot of factors in play. But what I'm very interested in is how we use places that are in our control to some extent, like our houses, our gardens, our workstations or workrooms, to as our business card to project to the world who we are, and how places that are supposedly under our control sometimes betray us. I'll give you an example what I mean by this. So let's say so let's say you walk into somebody's apartment and it's a very neat beige apartment and it's really tastefully decorated with, whatever, flowers and everything, but there's not even one book inside. To me, not having even one book inside is not probably intentional.
Red flag.
Red flag, exactly. But it's also, it's something that I suspect this person did not consider. It's something with betrayal. Or if you come to somebody's house and you don't see any photos of anybody, like any family photos, anything like that, it also says to you something, not necessarily bad, but it says something profound about the person they may not have intended to project. But then, of course, you have all these houses where people pay. That's very funny. It's something I would love to set a fictional scene in a place where, how people often pay a lot of money to interior designers to present them as really arty and sophisticated when they're not. That's why they need to pay the interior designers. And so
or
they
stylists,
have exactly. So they have all this artwork. They don't know who did it or why.
Or a personal shopper.
Yeah, exactly. So there's so much potential to say so much about the human condition by looking at this bi-directional relationship between people and place, what we're trying to do to places, what places do to us. But there's much more we can do. We can go even deeper with place in our writing. And tell me to shut up if I'm talking too much.
No, please go on.
I think that often places in writing can carry they can actually deepen characters and show characters' psychology and their emotional states, because if you have a character, and in memoir you always have a character narrating the story, and in fiction sometimes a particular character tells the story, the way people describe places in their writing usually says something about them. So for me, when I enter a house, a new house I've never been to, the first thing I'll notice is indeed the absence or presence of books. That's the first thing I'll be drawn to. And if I'll see too many family photos, I'll think, this person is very boring. That's probably, that's just how I am. I don't like houses with too many family photos. And I love houses with a lot of books. So I'll definitely be making judgments about the people based on their surroundings. But actually, by me, let's say I'm a character in the book, but by how I will tell about other people's houses and the judgments I'll pronounce about them, it will probably reveal a lot about my own values, what I value, what's important to me. So I don't like child-centric houses. I like book-centric houses, for example, which is all true, by the way. And so there's a lot of potential to play with descriptions of place to actually say something about the people who are in the story. But we can go even further than that and use place in our works to showcase thematical, the themes of the work. So, for example, there's a beautiful, beautiful Russian story, Ilana, that being from Russia yourself, you may know. Have you ever read Isaac Babel?
No, I haven't.
Isaac Babel is one of the most exciting, really gifted Jewish Russian writers. Of course, he was killed young by Stalin, as you would expect. It happened to a lot of brilliant Jewish Russian writers and just generally brilliant Russian writers at that time. But he wrote amazing short stories. And one of his short stories, for example, about war, about Russian invasion to Poland starts with describing the landscape. And the description of the landscape, again, I can't cite it verbatim, but it goes. He describes the sun is in the sky. It's rolls like lopped off head. There is a smell of blood from yesterday's slaughtered horses. And really what he does by describing the place where the Red Army sort of enter in Poland is to preempt what will happen in the story later, when there will be a lot of lopped off heads and blood, but of people this time.
A bit of foreshadowing.
Exactly, foreshadowing by using place.
We've just had a text message come in. Hi, Ilana, please ask Lee a question. This one's from Ella. How does she relate to the Australian landscape, and does she write about Australian places? Also, who are some of her favourite and most influential writers besides Joan Didion, who I love? Thank you, Ella. Thanks so much for your message, Ella. So the first question was there, how do you relate to the Australian landscape, and how do you write about Australian places?
Wonderful. So when I just arrived in Australia, I was here maybe 4 or 5 years. I started sort of going to different writers groups. And basically my impression was, and I was also told, that unless I set my work in Australian outback, and I have some old people there, like older people and clouds and trees and bush, I can't publish anything here. Which was very off-putting for me, because I'm very much not a nature person. So like everybody else, I suppose I don't mind going for a walk on the bush, or, being a bit in the country, but God, no. My idea of nature is a park, in the middle of the city. So I was very, very sort of despondent about it. But then I started publishing stories here, very urban stories. And somehow they started being published. So actually, because I'm very interested in cities. Cities are my big love as a writer, especially because I moved between so many cities. Actually, in Australia, I started from Sydney. So I really loved in my first years here to describe the trams of Melbourne, the jazz cafes here, the slickness, the sexy but mean slickness of Sydney. I kind of really, there's so many interesting different personalities to the cities here. But then I started traveling more in the country, in New South Wales and Victoria, in WA eventually, Queensland, and I started being very interested in the bush. But I'm not the kind of writer I'm not like Virginia Woolf. Well, of course I'm not like Virginia Woolf, who can be like Virginia Woolf, but I don't have any also interest in describing in minute detail like the leaves or the insects or what kind of trees I see. It's totally boring for me. What I like doing, I like short and sharp descriptions when I write about Australian bush. I do write occasionally. But I perceive it. I perceive nature, and in Australia, of course, the bush is the place that everybody writes about, because that's the ultimate sort of supposed to be Australia. I perceive the bush in very broad brushstrokes. For me, the bush is about mood. So it's not about the detail; it's about the mood it induces in me, very selfishly. So when I write about Australian outback, for example, I write about the spider webs that I see on trees, the melancholy that I sometimes get, the feeling that I get very dwarfed when I see all this tall eucalyptus, and how I kind of enjoy this melancholy. The bush makes me sad, but in a nice, pleasant way. So I do I do engage with both the urban and rural landscapes of Australia, but I really come to it from a very very kind of outsider's perspective as well. Like, for example, all those snooker places in Australia, we didn't have them in Israel. I mean, in Israel, snooker, I don't know how it's
like
now.
Billiards, yeah?
Yeah. So the billiard, like in Israel, 25 years ago I'm talking about, I don't know what it's like now, but billiard was very stigmatized. It was something like that usually criminals did. Whereas here in Australia, for me, traveling in the country and I learned here to play snooker because I didn't have I didn't really hang out much with criminals in Israel. A little bit actually when I was in my teens, but not to the extent that I learned billiard. But so for me, learning billiard here and going to all these little pubs in the country was for me much more interesting to describe those places than describing the lives in the bush.
Fantastic.
Sorry, I'm probably answering your question in a very roundabout way, but...
Well, I loved your answer. I loved hearing about your reading of the bush and kind of debunking some of that mythology that we have about the bush, or how we expect to read about the bush in this kind of glossy sunset, nostalgic almost feeling with a sepia tone. And Ella's second part of her question is, who are some of your favourite or most influential writers besides Joan Didion?
It's a wonderful question. So because we're talking about plays, I'll be answering in relation to writers of plays. Because I have a lot of writers that have shaped me. I'm one of those slowly almost extinct writers who believe that reading is extremely important. I really think it's 50% of the art. But so in terms of writers of plays, apart from Joan Didion, I would think, Helen Garner is really fantastic with her very crisp depictions again of urban places. She's very short, she's very sharp, and also she sometimes describes the bush. And again, I love her descriptions because they're short, they're sharp. She's not waxing lyric. Like Virginia Woolf, I can see how she's very talented, but she's not my kind of a writer. I love Robert Dessay. He does a lot of travel writing. So Helen Garner and Robert Dessay, they're my favorite Australian writers.
I'm getting such a big reading list after this conversation this evening.
Well, I think you would really like them. I think they all have also great sense of humor as you do. So I think you'll.
Thank you. That's very kind. I'm curious how you're actually attracted to these sharper, more precise descriptors of place. Why do you think that is for you?
I think I'm generally a very greedy person in my reading as well as in any other aspect of my life. That's why I was attracted to non-monogamy in the first place. So when I read, I want to know a lot about a lot of things, and I just get bored. I just get bored of reading about a lot of descriptions. To be honest, maybe it's my attention span as well. These days, I love Tolstoy. I just read Anna Karenina for the first time actually in Russian a few years ago, and I was struck, and I loved it. But there were some pages that I skipped because there was like in the middle there were like 20 pages about the agriculture and cultural methods of growing wheat or something. For me, good writing generally, not just plays, it's less is more. Because I think and I like to write like this as well, I think we writers need to trust our readers that they get things. And I think it's often a much harder task. That's why I'm so shit in poetry. It's a much harder task to capture something precisely and briefly as opposed to waffling for a long time.
That's very, very true. There's a lot of transferable lessons here, and I want to pick your brain a little bit for how can architects or students or creatives who aren't naturally writers, may be interested in writing, may be practicing, but by nature of their profession have to write about their projects, either for a submission, for an exhibition, for a competition, just on their website. They're looking to describe their project, something they've just built, they're finished, or maybe it's just a site that they've started working on. What's some of your best advice?
So I'm going to come to this from creative perspective. So maybe everything else said will be of absolutely no relevance to architects because you have your own sort of jargon and way of doing things. But I have read actually a lot of architectural descriptions because it is one of my hobbies, design. I'm very interested in design of buildings and interior design especially. And there are a lot of cliches that architects use, and I can't. You'll know them much better than me, obviously.
They're banned on this program. That's why Radio Architecture with Ilana Razbash is exclusively in plain language.
Fantastic.
You're preaching to the converted here.
Fantastic. So you know what I mean. All this flowing something or whatever. So I would suggest, look, and I don't know if that's commercially viable, but if they were writing for somebody like me, for customers like me I would suggest to avoid cliches and being very specific with examples. And this is what in creative writing always works as well.
That's the necessary truth. I think, unfortunately, people think that there's an industry language or that's the expectation. But people are people. Your clients who are commissioning architecture are real human beings. So it's important to communicate to people as such.
Exactly. And it's the same thing with, the real estate advertisements, when they advertise houses. It's all in the same language.
Cozy means microscopic.
Yes, but even just the embellishments. Sorry, not even the euphemisms, but just like every kitchen is a gourmet kitchen, for example. That drives me nuts. Why not to say this kitchen has a double oven, but you can feed like 10 people, things like that. So that's for me much more convincing than gourmet kitchen. What does it even mean, gourmet kitchen? Do you know what I mean? So that's what I'm talking about in terms of specific language with examples. I would be sold straight away if somebody said to me, this is a kitchen with an oven that can feed 10 people and there's a room for double fridge or whatever, things like that.
Yeah, the specific truths of the project. And what about when you do want to share a bit more of the story where, a slightly longer nuance is required? How do people balance that specificity? Or do you have any strategies for what are the things we should be looking for?
I think it can be long. As long as it's specific, it can be long. It doesn't have to be short. But it's just like, instead of saying magnificent views, it's to say views of what? That's really the difference. And then it doesn't matter. I mean, it can be a longer or short description, but also it will help. It just will help people to imagine what it would be like to live in this house.
Absolutely. We talked about the human condition this evening a bit. Have you found that people are more receptive to certain words or certain language over other?
Look, once again, it's corporate language or business language is so different from creative language. And I mentor and teach quite a lot of people who come from corporate sector and a lot of and from academic sector as well. And a lot of the work I do with people who come from corporate or academic sector is first for unlearning the usual language, which is exactly what you're talking about, the jargon. And you already you clearly you are ideologically committed to that. So what could I say? Yeah, it's really hard for me to talk in generalities. I just need to see the text and then I can just say but really, I think what I would also suggest, actually, I do have one more tip, but I can offer, and I don't know if it's useful, but I think it will speak more. This sort of text will speak more to potential clients if they more in a more conversational rather than formal, uptight kind of language, because then it will be more intimate. It's a bit like with real estate agents, like if you meet a real estate, there are real estate agents that you meet, but is not sort of totally suited and like a robot and shakes your hand in a particular way, but just like talks to you and says, it really helps, I think, to talk about stories of what this house was before, or who it belonged to, or what kind of family lived there. It really
the human element of it, the human aspect.
Yeah, so really, I think it's about storytelling. It's a bit like with interviews, like radio interviews. The worst thing I think I can do when I get asked a question, Ilana, maybe I'm delusional and you tell me, but I think as an interviewee, the worst thing I can do when I'm asked a question is to earnestly try and answer it. I think instead it's much more endearing to spin a story. Like how you asked me, how did you start as a writer? I could have said, so I wrote my first book. My first book was published when I was 20, and then I wrote another book. So instead of this, I decided to tell you a story about Siberia and the bird that flies in the sky. So I think it's the same with
take people on a journey.
Yeah. Well, John. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm a bit allergic to the word journey, but sorry.
Excellent.
But it's more like, think about yourself as Homer. I know that sounds very pompous, but really, I mean, what's Homer? Homer wasn't pompous. He was an ancient poet who would, if he even existed, who would sit around the fire and just tell people stories, just, bullshit them about gods and stuff. Just telling stories, just sharing stories. I think it can be very effective. Would definitely be effective if somebody like me.
It's certainly part of our actual human behavior. And it's interesting, I've heard people talk about music or performance in a way that, what if we considered this not as a skill or as a talent or just a human behavior that most humans do?
I love that. I've never heard this idea before.
The same perhaps it can be with stories. I'm mindful of the time, I really want to pick your brain on how we can communicate better about value. How can design professionals who aren't writers unpick value and communicate value? Because so eloquently earlier in our conversation, you explained very clearly, very sharply, why you liked all these homes and places and why these spaces where you wrote worked and didn't work for you, why it wasn't or was a bad or good stay in the villa. So
when you say value, do you mean like the personal value of the space for people? So I'll tell you what, this may sound corny and cliche, but it's just because I'm doing it spontaneously and I haven't thought about it. But even if I read a description of a house and it says something like there's a really nice nook there where you can put a couch and cuddle on the couch, things like, I think through action, if you attach potential action to the spaces you're describing. So not a gourmet kitchen, but here's a kitchen where you can cook for 10 people because there's a big oven. Here's a kitchen that will suit a large family and will very comfortably fit all the weekly shopping in the fridge. So I think here's the hospital where kids can look through the window and see trees. So attaching specific action because action signals value. I mean, we value aesthetic pleasure for kids. We value well-fed family, things like that.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. I've never heard it described in such a way, because I think sometimes when we get into this moral panic of trying to communicate the value of architecture, because it's imperative and incumbent on all design professionals really to communicate the value of our work, when it's getting harder and harder to advocate for it, we look towards data sometimes and we think numbers and data and statistics are going to save us. And action is something very, very interesting. And I hope that there'll be some takeaways and some experiments from listeners, and maybe people can write to us and whether that's worked or not for them. Action is a way to communicate. Well, I'm mindful of the time. I do want to ask my last question, and that's, what gives you hope?
The little things in life, really. I don't know. I just cooked a very nice, rich winter soup for my kids and my husband, myself. On this winter, the winter day was so grey and kind of depressing, but the soup warmed up the whole house and made it feel nice. So these little acts of every day give me hope that life is worth living, even when the world is burning.
Small actions, small gestures, small pleasures. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the program, Lee, and you've been so generous with your words, with your truth, with your story, so candid. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the interview.
Thanks for joining me for another evening of Radio Architecture with Ilana Razbash. This live show was broadcast and recorded in the Radio Karim studio on Bunurong country. You can replay the show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in and supporting community radio.
Hello, this is Kieran Carroll, the playwright from Edithvale, and you're on Radio Karim, a great station that gives many, many voices a chance